Hi everyone and welcome to my live stream again. Sorry for this small delay. Well, it's not everything totally ready yet, but I'm starting anyway. Today we are going to speak about the King's Indian. Yeah, there were some technical issues and problems with the camera and everything. So, but now it's almost everything okay. I decided to start anyway, and yeah, here we are. So today, King's Indian is the topic, and actually today is basically the number one video, even though it's a live stream. It's the number one video of a series that I want to do about the King's Indian. But well, normally when someone, an author or anyone does something about the King's Indian, it's mostly for the black pieces, from the black side. In my case, I want to do it from the other side because I'm not a King's Indian player with black. I am rather someone who tries to beat the King's Indian, and I have sometimes managed to do so with success in some games. Sometimes I've been hit because the King's Indian itself is a very interesting, fascinating, aggressive opening, and it's not very easy to tackle. Actually, what we can say about the King's Indian, and in that sense, I really invite you to put your comment in the box there in the chat on the left or on the right of the screen. The King's Indian is really an opening which brings passion to people, whether you love it, whether you hate it, whether you want to crush it, or whether you want to crush your opponents when playing the King's Indian as black. There is always a lot of passion. There are other openings in chess which kind of generate the same kind of feelings, emotions. But the King's Indian is certainly one which is very attractive because you know, when you play it as black, you wanna beat your opponent, you wanna mate your opponent. It's not one of those Queen's Gambits or you know, even Grunfeld, where you play chess, of course, but there is not the same direct, basic aim of, so to say, killing your opponent. In the King's Indian, you have this. You're going for the throat. It doesn't always work, of course. Your opponents as white don't always allow you to launch your favorite mating attack. But basically, when you play the King's Indian, what you're hoping for is to get one of those positions where you can start and launch an attack against your opponent. Well, yeah, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, of course, and see who says things and so on. Let me see. We are going to, in the first part of this video, we are going to explain basically what is about in the King's Indian, what pawn structures can arise, the basic ideas on how to play them with white, especially because I'm going to make this video series about the King's Indian on how to beat, how to crush the King's Indian, and this is the starting video. So this one is basically aimed at explaining the main ideas, also for black, of course, the dangers for white, for black, and in the end I'm going to show a little game of mine which I won more than 20 years ago already, with white in the King's Indian, in one of my favorite weapons with white against this opening. It's a game which cannot be found in the database because it's not been published back then. You know, it was not, not live games as today. So yeah, that game didn't come into the database. So I'm going to let you discover it here. And well, that's about it. So let's move now to chess base. Here we are, and That's well, that's the starting position, and of course the King's Indian, as you certainly know, rises after these moves. Here white can play knight f3 or knight c3, but basically black's main moves are knight f6, g6, bishop g7, and then castle d6, and so on. And the advantage when you play the King's Indian for black is that you can do it against d4, against c4, or against knight f3 on move 1. So basically you cover 3 of the main moves for white. You don't have to be worried too much about c4. Of course, white isn't forced to play d4. He can put his pawn on d3 if he wants, and it's going to be an English setup. But you're basically going to play your knight f6, bishop g6, bishop g7, d6, castle, basically blindfold, and then everything is going to be okay. For white, of course, there are different setups. We're going to discuss some of them, of course, but basically we are going to examine mostly, or take as a basis, let's say, the classical way of developing for white, which is to play e4 and then knight f3 and bishop e2. The reason for this is that from here you can get the main pawn structures in the King's Indian, which can arise. Basically, there are not too many of them. And it's not always the case with the other lines. I mean, the main, I'm just going to mention them after e5. The basic 2 pawn structures in the King's Indian arise after either when white closes the center with d5, whether he does it now or a bit later. And the other pawn structure is when black manages to take on d4, let's say after white's main move, castle, and now e takes d4, knight takes d4. We have these 2 main pawn structures, which have very different ideas. So we are going to talk about them separately. And of course, in my several videos, actually there are going to be quite a few of them, which I'm going to publish on my channel. So whenever you feel free, of course, to go and check them whenever I publish them. It's going to be quite regularly. I'm not going to do this only in the coming weeks or months, but I'm certainly going to publish them quite regularly over this period of time. And so they are going to feature, of course, this pawn structure and the closed pawn center. And some of these games are going to be my games. Of course, I'm going to take a look at games of other players, some of them quite strong. Just a second, please. And in this pawn structure, when black has taken here on d4, we have, of course, a position where white has more space, but this is quite common in the King's Indian. When you play bishop g7 here, or I could even say when you play g6 on move 2 with black, you basically accept to give your opponent more space in the center. I mean, white is going to control the center, and he's going to take space on this very important part of the board. But of course, it's not that easy. I mean, otherwise chess would be solved pretty easily. So the thing is that black tries to counterattack in the center, and trying to close the center is a basic part of black's strategy. When he manages to do this after d5, after white plays d5, actually the closing of the center gives both sides, but black of course as well, a sign that he can start an attack on the wing, and here it's going to be on the king side. Before the center is closed, such an attack is very unlikely to succeed. The reason is that, and this dates back to Nimzowitsch and his books like My System, but also not just Nimzowitsch, of course, but he actually formulated in his system, in his book My System, that an attack on the wing can only succeed if the center is stabilized somehow. And he gave a few examples from his practice, of course, as well, where an attack on the wing was premature and would fail because the opponent could counterattack in the center, which is the main strategy when your opponent tries to attack on a wing. Try to open the center, counterattack in the center. That's very typical. So that's why the attack of black is only going to succeed as soon or when white plays d5 and thus closes the center. Now, how is he going to attack here? Well, it's for those of you who play d4, or those of you who, as black, play the King's Indian, you obviously know that the main attacking move, the starting move of black's attack is going to be f7, f5 at some point. So black needs to find a square for this knight on f6. It can be h5, it can be e8. Well, several moves. I mean, I'm not talking about theory here. I'm just showing the idea. Let's say knight e8, and let's say white can castle here, and black plays f5. And well, from here on, of course, many pawn structures can rise, whether white takes here on f5, whether black takes later on e4, but generally you get such a pawn structure here when f4 happens, and this is basically the classical way, the classical variation in the King's Indian, where black is going to start his attack. With g5, with g4, h5 and so on, he's going to push his pawn, he's going to open the king side and try to explode white's castle there. What can we say about this attack is that, what we can say is that generally, well, white is going to start an offensive on the other side of the board, b4, c5, try to also to break the queen side, and in the end invade black's camp, whether it is on the c file, for instance, or break open, create a passed pawn, or win some pawns. Usually white is faster with his attack, but the price you can win in your attack is greater for black. There is the king here on g1. Whereas here, whether you win 1, 2, 3 pawns on the queen side, well, congratulations, but on the other side you win the game. That's the white king. That's why basically the King's Indian is actually such a fascinating opening, because black is going for the throat very early on. So it's you know, it's very challenging, of course, for black, but also for white. Because if you decide as white to go for the classical line in this, then it means it actually means that you take a risk to get mated. I mean, maybe you will manage. Well, the basic question is whether you manage to how to say, if you manage to let's say blockade or block the black's attack there, generally you are going to succeed then. And let me just see something on my computer there, because it's making something strange. Here we are. I had some problem with the chat, but I think now it's all solved. So yeah, now I can see everything. I can see Mark Cram, regular here, Jean-Marc Le Prêtre, bonsoir, Omkar as usual as well. So hello everyone. And yeah, well, I was a bit late as well, so apologies for this. First of all, some technical problems, and yeah, the King's Indian is, as said, if white succeeds in stopping black's attack, or let's say preventing black from mating the white king, then he's going to win the game. And the question is whether black is going to succeed as well. So in other words, the worth of every move is very high. the price you pay for a mistake can be lethal. You can lose the game after just one mistake. You may be much better, and one mistake for your king and you lose the game within a few moves. So this is why this opening is so interesting, actually. And of course, white is, I know many very strong white players who don't really want to go into this because they understand that they need to be wary at all time, every move, and those they choose other variations like the probably the fianchetto variation for white is the safest against the King's Indian. It may not be the most ambitious, but in the long term it's very safe because you have already created some kind of shelter for your king with a bishop here to defend him or defend it as well. So in the fianchetto variation of the King's Indian, black will find it more difficult to attack, but there are some drawbacks to playing g3. First of all, there is this very important question, what we are going to do with white against the Grunfeld, c6 and d5, which is nowadays at least considered as a very safe weapon for black. Well, I'm trying to follow with your comments in the chat. So Omkar says that he's planning to play the King's Indian. So we are going to be opponents then. Yeah? Recently you lost without a fight with your Slav. Well, it can be a good yeah, it can be a starting point for a new opening, of course, but it can also be you know, enticing to work on your Slav just a bit more. I mean, how many games have I lost in my favorite French, in my favorite Sicilian, or in my favorite Slav as well? When I used to play it, I lost many games in almost all openings, and I'm also going to show in one of those videos later a game which I lost in the King's Indian against quite a weaker opponent than me, and when I crushed him, and in the end I made a very stupid mistake and lost the game where I should have won it. Well, I didn't give up d4, I didn't give up on the classical main line. So sometimes, you know, a painful defeat is an incentive to work even more on your openings, on your play in general. So yeah, of course. And hello Noah as well. Yeah, okay, I wasn't planning on doing anything on the Pierts or the modern against e4, but I can certainly say a few words about the differences. The thing is, when you play the Pierts or the modern, which are very similar basically, like this, well, the main difference is clear. White hasn't played c4, so here, whether you play f4, of course f4 is an aggressive line, or you can play bishop e3. But basically in the Pierts, white is usually going to be the one who tries to attack on the king side. He can do so. There is this plan with bishop e3, f3, and then an early h4, queen d2, bishop h6. The whole setup here is a bit more solid in the center. White doesn't really claim that he has got an advantage in the center, even though he controls d4 and e4 in a better way. But usually he's gonna start an attack, or when you play the classical also against the Pierts with knight f3, there you're going to move in more positional waters. So black usually is, in these lines, he's not going to launch his usual attack, and he's not going to succeed in doing so. Because let's take the classical to just compare. We haven't played c4. Well, first of all, here e5 is more or less out of the question at the moment, because it will cost a pawn, which is not the case in the King's Indian. And so we start preparing it with a knight bd7 or bishop g4. Such moves are possible, or you can play c6 as well. And well, at some point you manage to play e5. But it's clear that whenever let's move like a few typical moves here. We can play h3, for instance, knight bd7, and I'll just say bishop e3, e5. if we compare this with the King's Indian, here d5 is hardly a good move for white, because he's going to surrender space somehow. If I take here, then I'm going to organize f5 very easily, and I'm going to get these 2 pawns here. So white is not going to react with d5. He's going either to leave it like this for a while, or to take on e5 and play knight d2, for instance, try to play knight c4. Well, I've played this a couple of times with white, and so that's the basic difference, is that this pawn on c4 is not here in the Piers, so that white's reaction d4, d5 is not available most of the time. Plus the Piers also have its own ideas, like you can play f4, the most aggressive perhaps, and knight f3 when black can play castle, or c5 when we play c5. Then it's, you know, you don't get your usual King's Indian. Now if I play d5, it's not a Benoni. So that's, I mean, to be very short, because we could speak about the Piers modern for many hours, of course, and of course there are very good books written on it as well. So basically that's the main difference here. When playing c4, white really has the idea at some point to play d5 and perhaps to play b4, c5. So he's already like taken an advantage on the queen side, and this is where he's going to play, definitely. So yeah, I mentioned the fianchetto variation and the possibility for black usually nowadays to go for a Grunfeld with c6 and d5, the most reliable perhaps for black against g3. Well, there are other lines, of course. There is also the f4, the 4 pawns attack, which is yeah, very critical as well. But black usually likes this type of positions. There is the same-ish, also very interesting, already developed back then by Botvinnik, for instance. And yeah, by playing f3, white really says he wants to strengthen his pawn center, the pawn on e4, but on the other hand, of course, his development is being slowed down. And here again, whenever black is going to play e5, which is not the only reaction here for black against the same-ish, then again you can wait a bit with knight e2, for instance, or you can decide to close the center immediately with d5. But then you've already got this let's call it ideal pawn chain for white, the strongest possible. On the other hand, your knight on e2, on g1 is deprived of its best square. That's what I actually want to discuss here when we play e5 and close the center. And my favorite way actually to do it is in the classical. Actually, the King's Indian can be played in different ways for black as well. He can try to provoke the closing of the center by going knight c6, and this even costs kind of a tempo in a way, because here when you play knight c6, you clearly tell your opponent, come and play d5. I want you to close the center, and I even give you a tempo for that. d5, my knight is attacked. I have to go back to e7. On e7, the knight is not doing too well for black. It's not placed really ideally here. It will take many moves until the knight can be activated whenever, let's say, black has played f5, g5, f5, f4, and g5. Then he can play knight to g6, but this really takes time. First you need to move that knight away and so on, and in the meantime the knight on e7 doesn't control crucial squares. In this closed pawn center, a crucial square for black is c5, and this is why actually when I mentioned d5 here, usually black, when you play d5, immediately is going to try and blockade white from taking space here on the queen side. He's going to play a5, and this knight is going to come to c5 via a6 or d7, and c5 is a strong square for the knight, especially since it's been secured by the pawn on a5. So this is why this immediate move d5 is not my favorite, even though, I mean, great players have done it, and Kramnik has played it. Well, I've played it a bit also earlier, some 25 years ago. But it was, for instance, Petrosian's, the former world champion, Petrosian's favorite to play d5 and wait for a while until he castles. Because perhaps the white king will feel better on the queen side at some point. But let's actually consider the classical mainline castle here. Knight c6, which I'm going to promote in the text, d5, knight e7. So not ideal for black, but this is, we call it the Mar del Plata variation, because it's been kind of invented during that tournament in Mar del Plata in the 50s by some great players. There were several Soviet players. There was also Najdorf, and they actually launched that. This knight e1 was played, and white is trying to play, you know, for c5, very straightforward way. But in fact, if just to mention one thing here, white's ideal, if he could get that, white's ideal setup would be to play bishop e3, and on any move which is not knight g4, because knight g4 is the real problem against bishop e3. But let's say black plays this here, then knight d2, f5, f3, and now you've reached your ideal way of placing pieces, which is bishop on e3. Whenever f4 comes, you go back to f2, and the knight on d2 is going to, let's show it like this, yeah, b4, h5, c5. For the moment, g4 is not possible. You are 3 times on it, so you need to somehow prepare that. Knight back to f6, and now knight to c4. And the ideal is to have these things here: the bishop on f2, the 2 knights here on c4 and c3, because this one is going to go to b5. And let's say now, let's say g4. Now we can already take, play knight b5, hitting d6, and also hitting here the pawn on a7. I mean, this would more or less already be curtains here. White would be winning. Well, as I said, this is the ideal thing, and unfortunately this is knight g4. But I just wanted to highlight this bishop e3, knight d2 would be the ideal way to develop or configure white's pieces. The problem is it doesn't really work. So we need to try and get this in the ideal way. So some people tried knight e1 immediately. My favorite is the bayonet b4. As you may know, actually this bayonet has, you know, has appeared, has seen the light of the day or the chessboard, let's say, many years ago. And I can say hello, nature. Valjanat. First time I see you here, so welcome to this live stream, and I hope you will enjoy that, and I'm gonna see you more often here. So this b4 was invented in the 50s, 60s, but it never really became popular until 1995, more or less, when white found, after knight h5, this move rook e1, which we are going to not to discuss it too much in details here, because it would be a bit too long. But basically black is not going to be able to launch his usual kingside attack here. The thing is, we play rook e1. The idea is to keep the bishop, and we remain here with the knight long enough so that after f5 we can play knight g5. More or less this is going to be the topic of the game I'm going to show you a bit later at the end of this live stream. So this bayonet with knight h5, rook e1 was kind of a blow against King's Indian devotees, and there have been many actually in the history of, you know, in the, let's say now maybe 70 years history of the King's Indian, and you know, there have been the ones I mentioned at the start, those Soviet champions like Taimanov. There were many of them. Geller, of course. Most of them have played. Even Korchnoi, who was a fierce opponent, one of the, you know, greatest opponents against the King's Indian. So he's tried to crush the King's Indian with white almost all of his career, but he's also played it as black sometimes. But in more recent times, of course, we can mention, well, there was world champions, of course, Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov. But in basically 1995 and in the years that followed, white players were led by Kramnik, and there was Ivan Sokolov, Van Velde and others who actually showed that it's very dangerous. And for black, it's not easy at all to launch, or almost impossible to get your favorite kingside attack. And basically for black players, if there is no kingside attack in the King's Indian, there is no fun anymore. And if there is no fun, there is no point in playing the King's Indian. So many great players of the King's Indian gave it up or changed gears somehow. I can think of Svitan, for instance, who was junior world champion in 1982, I think, and maybe 81. And he's always been a great specialist and a great player in the King's Indian, launching his attacks. And actually, he's won a fantastic games against Vtachnik. I'm certainly going to show it in one of my videos. But he gave it up after the bayonet arose. He told me, well, there is no mate anymore, so I'm not gonna play it. Well, it's not that easy, of course, and black has found antidotes against this bayonet with Rook E1, and he's actually doing fine. Theoretically, he's doing fine. But it's true that all the fun is gone for black, and so nature. You beat Hikaru in this line, yeah? Yeah, that's going to be the topic. My game against Nakamura from 2015 is going to be one of the videos I'm going to prepare. So keep an eye on my channel, and if you subscribe to it, then you're certainly going to get notifications. So I'm certainly going to take a look at this game and tell some stories behind that game. Actually, I beat Hikaru twice in the King's Indian Bayonet. The first time in Biel in 2005, which was also a very good game, and the second time in 2015. Well, I've now talked quite a bit about ideas for both sides when the center is closed. And I've also told you that black players sometimes even provoke white into playing d5 with this move knight c6. But it's not the only way for black. He can play the King's Indian in a more in an older fashion with the knight on bd7, for instance. I mean, this used to be, for instance, Tigran Petrosian's way of treating the King's Indian, because he's played many of the classical openings like Queen's Gambit, you know, Queen's Indian, Nimzo, Queen's Gambit accepted, and so on. But he's also been a great fan of King's Indian or old Indian setups, but always he's put the knight on d7, so really the classical way. By doing this, he basically avoids too many concrete opening lines, preparation. So basically he relies on his understanding, and he accepts that basically he's going to be probably slightly worse after the opening, but he also feels the potential of the King's Indian as black, and he would in the middle game then play it really well. So I'm just checking in the chat if there is nothing new now. It seems nothing new yet. So knight bd7 is a very reliable way of treating the King's Indian, even though I believe, because I'm a white player against the King's Indian, I believe knight bd7 to be a little bit passive, so basically a bit inferior to the classical knight c6. And well, knight a6 is also possible. It's perhaps a bit better maybe than knight bd7, or a bit more active in a way. It's not so easy for white to determine which is the best way against knight a6, sorry. And finally, there is this e takes d4 immediately when we get the other main pawn structure in the King's Indian setups, when e takes d4 happens. And then we have this typical way here, the two pawns on e4 and c4, which guarantee white space advantage. But black is not deprived of any counterplay, because after this exchange on d4, he can play rook e8 and put some pressure on the pawn on e4. And certainly he's going to develop his pieces either with a knight to c6 or that knight to d7, c5, and he's going to, you know, he's going to pretend that he stays on his nice squares, even though with slightly less space he can always wait a bit until he gets his counterplay. So, well, usually f3 happens, and white is happy to have a strong center, which is probably going to strengthen his two strongest pawns there, e4 and c4, with f3 and b3. And what can basically be said about this pawn structure is that white will use this outpost on d5. There is a semi-open file for white here, exactly as for black on the e file. White has a semi-open file, and this square on d5 is typically called an outpost, which is ideally occupied by a knight. If you can play knight d5 under good circumstances, then this knight is going to be a pain for black. And so ideas develop around these things, and well, of course, black is not deprived of counterplay. He can try to play a6 b5 at some point. It's not easy to make it work, but when it works, it definitely gives some counterplay. You can try to counter with f5. Well, even sometimes c5 is played, but well, it's certainly linked to some weakness, the square on d5, of course. And obviously, c6 is possible. I was speaking of this outpost on d5, so it only looks very natural for black to play c6, trying to control and prevent the knight from coming ever to d5. But the drawback of this move c6 is also obvious, that now d6 is being weakened, and white is certainly going to try and organize some pressure against it with bishop e3 or bishop f4 or even g5, and then doubling, or even if you can do that, but it's more difficult to triple your heavy pieces there on the d file. So you're going to double on the d file and certainly get some pressure. Well, black, if he manages to play d5, then he's usually going to do well. White obviously will try to prevent that freeing thrust in the center. Let me see. Do you know any book explaining Maroczy bind structures? Well, the Maroczy is a different, of course. I can show it through the King's Indian, because some King's Indian players like to play c5, which can lead to a Benoni if white answers with a d5. But white can also ignore that and play castle when after c takes d4, knight takes d4. Here we get the typical Maroczy pawn structure. So this here against e4 and c4. So c5 takes d4 has happened, and black has developed his bishop to g7. So it's very similar to the hedgehog, but it's actually in Maroczy e6 hasn't been played. If I know any books, it's a very good question, because I've never played the Maroczy as black. I've played it a lot as white, and I really like also playing it with white. I usually enjoy my space advantage when I play chess, and that's also why I play d4. I like to get c4 and e4 if I can, and get my space advantage. And those are actually my favorite pawn structure, whether c takes d4 or in the King's Indian e takes d4. But I wouldn't be able to recommend a book in the Maroczy, even though I'm sure there have been some. But I could actually recommend you to study games of certain players who play the Maroczy well. I could mention Ulf Andersson in recent years. Who else? Well, there are these Azeri grandmasters, quite young generation of Azeri grandmasters who've played that. I think Mamedov. I think Mamedov was the main advocate of black in the Maroczy. So by studying great players who who regularly play a certain openings, you can learn a great deal about these openings they have contributed in developing. So well, who else about the Maroxy? I think, well, but Yannick has played it sometimes, but he was not too fond of this in general. I can recall Anand playing the Maroxy, but mostly in blitz or rapid games, because it would allow him to shuffle his pieces and play very quickly. Well, yeah, but I could actually do a video or a live stream about the Maroxy at some point as well, certainly. So, but that's more or less what I can say about it. So, nature. If I play King's Indian, I can add Benoni and Benko. Well, that's something different then, yeah. The Benoni, you can get the Benoni through. I mean, you can't really force it, as I just mentioned. If you play c5 here, White is not forced to play d5. Whereas if you play c5 on move 2, then if White doesn't play d5, then you can get some active play as well. So d5 is certainly the critical answer here, and from there you can get the Benoni, e6 or g6 first, or as you mentioned, the Benko gambit with b5 immediately, which are certainly very attractive openings because they are very active. You can immediately play something, but at a higher level, I wouldn't call the Benko gambit very sound, even though, you know, there have been great players using it from time to time, mostly with surprise value, but some of them have actually added it. But with computers nowadays, it's very dangerous to play. I mean, at the highest level, I mean grandmaster level, it's very dangerous to play the Benko gambit on regular basis. It's good to have it as a surprise weapon, play it a few times a year perhaps, but not too much. And speaking about the Benoni, I think that Gashimov was the only top player who would use it regularly and with success actually. But okay, we are speaking here about the King's Indian, and well, those two pawn structures, the main ones, are actually the ones Black needs to study if he wants to play the King's Indian. And I think I more or less finished my presentation. I can see some people joining. Yannick Chess 2000, hello, welcome here. So I'm going actually to show you the game I prepared for today, which is a game I played 21 years ago in Hastings. The only time I played in the UK, that was in Hastings, this famous festival, when at that time, I think 97 was the last year when the Open would be played on the piers in Hastings. So Hastings is actually a sea resort by the sea, but the of course you have these huge piers then in Britain, and the Open was played on the piers, which was a very old construction. And I think a few years after I played in 97, the piers was actually destroyed by a storm. So you can see that sometimes playing chess is pretty, or can be pretty dangerous. And we could actually hear the wind and storms blowing. It was freezing cold in that playing hall. I remember playing with my winter coat on. And well, in that tournament I actually faced a few players which were interesting. I played against a very young Luke McShane, who was maybe 14 at the time, or 13 even at the time, already rated around 2400, and we actually played a King's Indian as well when we actually drew the game. But in this game I played against Danny Gormley, who was rated 2300 at the time, so was not a grandmaster. He's a grandmaster now, not a very strong one, but a grandmaster. And I was also rated quite low. I was 2440, or young I am, and I had added the bayonet to my repertoire, and yeah, here we went for a bayonet. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3, castle, bishop e2, e5, castle, knight c6, d5, knight e7, and b4. And I'd like to repeat that the game I'm showing you here has not gone into the main mega database, which you can have from ChessBase. I've annotated it for the Chess Informant, which was a book which used to be the Bible of chess back then for chess theory. Younger players nowadays won't probably know what is a Chess Informant or Chess Informator, even though it's still being published. But so I annotated it for this, so there is a database of games from Chess Informant, so it can be found there, but not in the main mega database. So here my opponent went for knight h5, rook e1, f5, and as I said before, yeah, knight e1 instead of b4. That's the Mar del Plata, as I said. It's very straightforward for both sides actually. Here f5, and here you can play several things. f3 is a move, bishop d2 is another move, and you know it's going to be both sides launching in their mutual attacks on their wings, and of course a huge amount of theory. And Korchnoi also liked a lot knight e1, but for this game I went for the bayonet with rook e1, and my opponent went for f5, which is nowadays also the main move. But after knight g5, as I mentioned, that's basically the main idea of the bayonet, that the knight remains on f3, waiting for f5 to arrive before going to g5, and then it can enter to e6. This is going to happen in the game as well. Well, nowadays you can see, this knight is attacked, and my opponent went to f4, sorry, when nowadays the main move is knight f6, and well, the main variation here, you can play f3 if you want. You can also play bishop f3, and the main variation goes like this one nowadays: takes and c6, and from here on white has many moves at his disposal. But normally this main line, this is recognized, the main line nowadays, and black is supposed to do okay, and I myself believe, even though I am a bayonet devotee, I also believe that black is doing okay here from this main line here. But my opponent went knight f4. At the time, 97, it was just barely 2 years after the bayonet and this rook e1 move had been found, and the bayonet had become popular. So you know, the main roads were not clearly determined for black at the time. So knight f4 was definitely seen as one of the main moves, but it gives white some possibilities in the center. Here I took on f4, pawn takes f4, and of course black is usually happy when this exchange happens, because the King's Indian bishop plays, it's been opened again, e5 has disappeared, and it actually has no counterpart. White has given up his own bishop, so there is not going to be an exchange of that bishop soon. So black is usually happy, but white has actually an idea behind, you know, or some ideas up his sleeves here. Rook c1, here he took on e4, played knight c takes e4, he went knight f5, and I went bishop g4. So both sides actually occupy squares which seem juicy to them. For black it's the square on d4, and for white it's going to be the square on e6. I believe the square on e6 is a bit more attractive. It's further in the camp, and whenever black takes on e6, there appears an interesting passed pawn there on e6. For instance, after h6, immediately I'd play knight e6, of course, takes, and if queen e7, then comes the usual break for white, because if white waits for too long here, black will certainly be able to organize his play around the pawn e6, and eventually he might well be able to take it. So we don't want to lose this pawn. So here c5 is the good move, and it's not easy, because if black opens, if he takes on c5, then I'm going to take with my knight, obviously. Program here is so there has been a small disconnection. I don't know if you can still see me or hear me, but now it tells me it's okay. Let me check. It should be okay, so I hope it's going to be fine. We're here again. I hope it's working soon. So we're back apparently. Let me just pause for a second. Sorry for this, sometimes the program disconnects. I'm writing there. So something is wrong. Something is wrong and I don't know why. So sorry for this. It looks like the stream is not working great. Let me see if I can get that here. Sometimes internet or the program can have some problem. So so it's fine again. Okay, good to see, good to hear that. Thanks. Okay, sorry for that interruption. Let me open again the chess base. So you probably stopped hearing me when I said that my opponent played knight d4. And from the database, most games, there were not so many, maybe 10 or a bit less. Most games go bishop takes c8, but here I played bishop e6, which I think is a perhaps better continuation than exchanging on e6, on c8. I force black to take on e6 because otherwise knight f7 check, and of course after taking first, once I take back with the knight, forking the queen and the rook, so he has to take me and I take back, and here we have again this typical position. Actually this is more or less, even though it might objectively not be too clear, more or less this is what bayonet players want to get when they go for this line as white. It's this huge beautiful pawn on e6. It might get lost at some point, but white always has activity for the pawn, and for the moment the pawn is still there, so it's not clear if black is going to be able to take it. The problem for white is actually that the connection between the rook and the pawn might be lost or interrupted, a bit like our connection before, because of bishop e5. It won't be so easy to kick this bishop away from e5. Well, actually, if he plays bishop e5 immediately, which objectively is a better continuation than what he played in the game, then I would play c5. And it's still not easy for black to get to my pawn on e6, because basically what I want to do now is to take on d6, and if he takes back with the pawn, I'm just going to put my queen on d5, supporting the pawn on e6. And I might have ideas, if I have the time to do it, to play knight d2 once my queen is on d5, to play knight d2, knight f3, or knight c4. And even if in the end he wins e6 and I win d6, my position is probably going to be preferable anyway, because his king has been weakened. Actually, this was, I can recall Viktor Korchnoi. He would jubilate whenever black would, in the King's Indian, black would lose because his king was under an attack suddenly, because he would just laugh at the black players and say, you see, you pushed your pawns in front of the king and now you get mated. This would be typical Viktor Korchnoi, and he, as I mentioned before, he was a fierce opponent of the King's Indian. Actually, I could tell many anecdotes about him. I'm just gonna take some time and tell one of them. This was 1997, the same year as this game, but played a bit before, because Hastings was the end of the year. Or actually, no, this was Hastings 96, 97. It would overlap of over the 2 years. So the game played by Korchnoi was a bit later in 1997 at the European Team Championship. Switzerland against Croatia. We played in Croatia, in Pula. And first board was Korchnoi against Svitan. As I mentioned before, Svitan, a great specialist in the King's Indian. And yeah, we would at the time we would play with can't remember, digital clocks or perhaps the old clocks still. In any case, the game started. I was playing, I think it was 3 or 4, and I could hear someone banging the clock, and this was Viktor Korchnoi. Of course, he was white, and Svitan had played the King's Indian, and Korchnoi was banging his preparation. He barely allowed Svitan to press his own clock, and he played like 20 or 19, 20 moves of his preparation, banging the clock, and Svitan was taking his time, so he was getting like 40 minutes, 45 minutes down on the clock, and when at some point Viktor stopped and started thinking. So we gathered on the board, and it appeared that Korchnoi's position was lost already. And so he started thinking and moving and thinking, and again he started playing some moves and banging the clock, and a bit later Svitan missed the winning continuation, and the game ended in a draw quite early actually compared to the other games. And I can still remember I was concentrating over my game, and I could hear just as the game finished, and Viktor was starting to shout and you, how can you play like this, and typical Korchnoi, of course. And but basically I don't really know why he would complain, because he was lost, and his whole show was not very correct from an ethical point of view. You can't really behave like this, but he was so much emotional about the King's Indian that he would often lose his temper and lose his control over his behavior sometimes. It would happen quite often, of course. Okay, that was about Viktor Korchnoi and the King's Indian. Let's go back to the game. My opponent played a move which seems to be very logical. He played Rook F5, because on the one hand he might want to, instead of putting the bishop on E5, he might want to put the rook. Just a second, I'm checking your commentary, because I can see Mr. Jean-Marc Laprete is saying that the video is pretty slow. Yeah, I'm sorry about this, and he's going to replay it tomorrow, so that's of course a good option to do so. You only just lose the opportunity to chat during and get my answer immediately. But of course, for those who are going to watch the video in replay, there is always the commentary section where you can leave comments, and I always get notifications, so I won't be slow to answer your questions or remarks. Don't worry. And Omkar says, if I play F3 instead of bishop E5, so you probably mean on move 18 here, will I have some compensation, or do you think that's just an extra pawn for you? Well, if you mean here F3, I think I'm just going to ignore this pawn. I mean, I'm not going to take it, because at the moment it's not causing any damage to my position. You can take on G2. It's important that you don't have Queen G5. I mean, this move is not an option for you because of my knight. So I'm not going to react here. I think I'm just going to play Queen D5, probably here. Well, of course you can't take on G2, but even if you could, it wouldn't really threaten my king anyhow. Well, here I have E7, of course. But and if you prevent that, if you play C6, then I win D6. What else? If you play King H8, then I guess I'm going to take on B7. Or I might also consider C5. Here F3 is certainly a move you could consider, but at this moment in time in the game, I think it's not the best move here. So I hope this was the moment you had in mind, and I hope I could answer your question. So he played Rook F5, some ideas like this, but he also controls the square on D5, as you could see in the previous variation when I answered your question. Queen D5 is definitely a move white wants to play here. So rook f5 is certainly meant to prevent that. But here, well, I thought for a long time during the game, I can still remember, and I suddenly saw an idea which appeared to be very interesting for me. And well, actually, I could have given it to you as a test. But it's yeah. Let's move forward. It would be nice if we could get e7, of course, and try to, of course, promote this pawn would be the ultimate goal for white. But how to organize this is not that easy. And this rook on f5 is a bit bothering me. So here I went c5, which seems to be good, but there is this main answer by black, which is d5. This was, of course, also the idea of black's last move, rook f5. Well, here the options are not very good for black. If he takes on c5, then I can exchange queens and take on c5 with my knight. And I'm threatening to take here. I also threaten to just move away with the knight and then take your pawn on c7. So not easy here for black, who is quite clearly worse probably. And if he plays bishop e5, then I'm just going to take on d6 and play queen a4. And here again I have nice options like queen d7, why not? Could be a nice option, because basically I want to get my rook to c7 at some point. Can't do it immediately, so queen d7 seems to be pretty useful move here. So that's not satisfactory for black. So d5 is quite clear. And here I had prepared the following very nice move, knight d6, which completely shocked my opponent. I can still remember that when he looked at this move and he waited like a minute before writing it down, trying to understand what was going on. And indeed it's not so obvious, but my pawns actually are going to move forward. And black basically doesn't have a choice. His rook is attacked, and I'm also threatening e7. So knight d6. What happens after c takes d6? Well, the game goes e7, queen d7, the obvious answer. He doesn't have anything better. And now c takes d6. And well, first sight it appears as though both pawns are pretty well blockaded here. The queen on d7, e8 is well controlled by black, by the rook, but it actually doesn't work, and white is capable here of crushing through with the pawns, and the rook threatens to go to c7 with e8 to follow the critical line. And actually the good thing about these old days, let's say 20 years ago, when some games wouldn't enter the database, is that sometimes you could even repeat the same ideas. And I got the chance to repeat the same game until here, a year later at the Zurich Open against a Swiss player who was weighted about 20 to 50 at the time. Here he went for the main answer, rook e8, and here comes the key idea of white. The reason why this combination works is rook c7, queen takes d6, queen a4, and the rook is attacked. It cannot be protected by any piece except perhaps rook back to f8, which costs the exchange, because king f7, and that's the real point, like king f7 fails to queen takes e8, king takes e8, rook c8, check, and I'm able to promote my queen, my pawn into a queen on the next move. So that actually is how the game ended, that game against the Swiss guy in Zurich. His name was Simon Jacob. Well, Gormley saw that and he played f3 here. Here comes the f3, but here it's a desperate attempt to stop, to try and launch some counterattack. But no, everything was over the board. No preparation. I think my preparation ended somewhere around move 14 or something like this, or maybe move 15. I think around here. And no, at the time I was not so deeply prepared. So here, yeah, Gormley went f3, and I played rook c7, and of course he cannot stop my pawns. So he took, I queened, takes, and to some extent the game is over. But of course black can also keep playing a bit. Of course it's just an exchange, but my rooks are very active and he doesn't really have any counter chances against my king here. He went queen c6, and I could have finished off the game a bit more convincingly, but it was still, everything was okay and I kept control here. Rook b8, pawn takes g2, queen e1, just playing through the final moves. Here rook c8, queen f4, queen e3. Of course I'm happy to get an ending, it would be quite easily winning. So he took on b4, played rook c7, check, played queen b2, and here I just took on a7 and he decided to resign. So basically the move rook takes a7 was not a bad one if he resigned, but I could have forced mate with queen e6 check and queen takes f5. Not very difficult and also quite cute. So yeah, it would have been a nice finish, but you know, basically the last, let's say, 10 moves of the game didn't really have much worth. Even though, you know, when you are winning, you still have to be careful, especially in the King's Indian. So yeah, a nice game with this knight d6, but it shows basically what I like about the bayonet in general, but also in my way of playing the King's Indian often goes with, you know, trying to get as much value as possible with your pawns, your advanced pawns, the one on d5, which does not always land on e6, of course. Even in the bayonet, but sometimes you're getting those pawn breaks there to get a passed pawn, and then you're making it, you know, you're trying it as hard as possible to make your pawn become very far advanced and thus much stronger. So well, as said, this is the first introductory video as a live stream even I'm doing in this video series which is basically called Crush the King's Indian, when I'm going to try and show my understanding of the King's Indian, how to try and play effectively against this very interesting opening, this very aggressive opening by black. So well, of course, if you have questions, I'm still very eager to read them in the chat. I'm soon going to end this this live stream, but of course, if you have any comments, remarks and questions, I'm of course keeping an eye on that, so don't hesitate to put them. Yes, I'm certainly going to show my game against Nakamura, perhaps even my 2 games against Nakamura from 2005 and 15. But I'm also going to show games of much greater players like Kramnik, who was, I say was because not many people dare playing the King's Indian against him anymore. So I should say he's a great King's Indian killer as white, and he also played the bayonet as soon as it appeared, as soon as it became popular in the mid-90s. He became one of those bayonet devotees as well. Well, Omkar, if you would ask this question, whether the King's Indian is objectively worse for black and he has only some practical chances, if you would ask this question to the late Viktor Krochnoy, he would certainly laugh and say, yes, you're right. But actually, no, it's not that simple. Chess is much more complex, and the King's Indian is much more complex than that. I like playing the King's Indian from the white side because I have this skeptical tendency, which has cost me dearly sometimes, to believe that black's attack is not really correct in a way, so I don't really like to play as black, and I have this tendency of believing that. So I certainly defend the white camp and the white's chances, but it's not so easy. And even I mentioned to you, if against the bayonet black goes for the main line, I personally don't have any advantage in my preparation there. So it's not worse for black. It's just you need to like those positions. You need to believe that you can make or mate. You can make it or mate him. Yeah, that's qualities which are needed, and Nakamura has played the King's Indian, has been playing the King's Indian, even though I think he's given it up recently. But he's been playing the King's Indian in the past years, and he's done really well. I remember a crushing game he's won against Wesley So, for instance, or he's even won a game against Kramnik, which was very dodgy for black, but he won it anyway. So Garry Kasparov always plays the King's Indian. Well, he does not always, because he stopped chess at all. Well, he also stopped playing the King's Indian almost completely after Kramnik demolished him in several lines, actually. The bayonet, but also the Petrosian variation. He mostly stopped. He stopped with the King's Indian in the end of the 90s. But he was a great player in the King's Indian, and he's beaten Korchnoi several times. Maybe I haven't shown my game against Nakamura. Against Carlsen, that was no King's Indian. So Omkar, yeah, thanks for staying so late. I am fully aware that in your country, in India, it's already late. I usually start at 8. So yeah, today was an exception, and I think next week is also going to be an exception, when I'll have to start at 8:30 again. But those are exceptions. Otherwise, I'll start at 8, so I make it a bit earlier for you. Well, not just for you, but it's earlier for you if we start at 8, and I think it's going to be, I hope, acceptable. So thank you everyone for watching, and of course for taking part in the chat, because this is also the main idea behind this live stream, that we actually can exchange ideas, communicate. This is the main point of it, and this is why it's also quite interesting for me, because I get reaction from you immediately. So thank you for following me, and thank you for your attention. For those who watch this video in replay, sorry for the small technical problem in the middle. I hope it won't affect too much. You can always put your comments, and of course you're welcome to put me a thumb and like this video and subscribe to my channel as well. Hope to see you next week. Thank you and goodbye.